Now that we're coming to the end of this module, I thought it might be worthwhile to reflect a little bit on the big picture. At the beginning of the term, we said we were going to talk about two questions. What kind of knower do I want to be? And what kind of knowledge community do I want to belong to? And we've certainly addressed those questions, and I think we've hit on some answers in a basic sense, at least. What kind of knower do I want to be? I want to be the kind of knower that's worthy of people's epistemic trust. And what kind of knowledge community do I want to belong to? I want to belong to a diverse knowledge community where people can trust each other, at least epistemically speaking. And I want to belong to the kind of community that other communities can trust or rely on. And so I think if you reflect back on some of the things that we've covered together, you can see them in this light. So the work on virtue epistemology, or accounts of the epistemic virtues, they're identifying those traits of individuals that if they have them, they will be more epistemically reliable, and so it would be a good idea to trust them. And when it comes to the epistemic vices, those are the traits that individuals have that it would not be a good idea for you to trust. Likewise, when we talked about the virtue of skillful reflection with Confucius, that was something that, again, is an epistemic virtue that when someone has it, it would be a good idea to rely on or trust them from an epistemic point of view. But it's also something that you need to have to be able to trust yourself from an epistemic point of view. You need this capacity to kind of reflect on your experience and what you know, and to revise the parts of your knowledge that turn out to be unreliable. And then we spent a lot of time also talking about how when it comes to knowledge, especially modern knowledge, we depend on each other to know things. So no trust, no knowledge. That could be a kind of slogan for social epistemology. Modern knowledge depends on trusting long chains of experts, and no single person is ever in the position to check up on the reliability of every member of that chain. Ask yourself, could you tell a good statistician from an incompetent one? A good biologist from a bad one? A good nuclear engineer or radiologist or macroeconomist from a bad one? So the idea is, and this is the kind of core premise of social epistemology, nobody can really assess such a long chain of knowledge by herself. Instead, we depend on a vastly complicated social structure of trust. So all the stuff that we talked about in social epistemology was sort of deeply connected to this issue of trust and whom we should put our trust in and why we put our trust in people and so forth. And we saw also in the work on the philosophy of science, especially the sociologically minded philosophers of science like Ludwig Fleck, they argued that a truly isolated investigator is impossible. Thinking is a collective activity. So this idea of epistemic trust is crucial to the practice of science. And we saw Kuhn sort of reiterate this point and deepen it in a number of ways. Scientists don't just share theories, but they share values, beliefs, and practices, and we need to study all of them. A scientific community is this integrated totality where people need to be able to trust each other in order to practice successful science. And Sandra Harding and Helen Longino, they reinforce this idea, and they say, not only do we need trust, but we need trust within diversity. So in order to not have a kind of weak objectivity, as Harding argues, where everyone essentially is kind of coming from the same point of view, and so they kind of can't see their own blind spots, and they don't have anyone in the community who can see their blind spots. You need this diverse community where people can sort of catch sight of other people's, from an epistemic point of view, shortcomings or blind spots, and help sort of develop a more complete picture of reality. And within that, we need to be able to trust each other. So you need not just trust, but you need trust within diversity. And then Oreskes makes the point that we don't just need trust between friends, and we don't just need trust within the epistemic community. We need people writ large, not just politicians, but also the people who elect politicians, to trust the scientific community. And she talked about some ways that science earns or tries to win that trust. One method or means of winning that trust is through education, namely teaching people about science's sustained engagement with the world in the demands of scientific consensus. And in many ways, Oresky's book is a great example of exactly what she's talking about, to the extent that she can reach people who are interested in finding out more about science. She can educate them about why science is worthy of our trust with this book. So she's a great example of the very thing that she's advocating. And Oresky also argues that we also need to focus on our shared values by showing that scientists do in fact have value commitments, and that the value commitments that they have to objectivity and transparency and truth and all these other epistemic virtues, those commitments are ones that they share with the wider community, and they can use that kind of common ground of shared values as a foundation from which to draw upon when asking each other, please trust us. So it's not a kind of blind trust or a kind of uninformed trust. It's rather a trust that's grounded in reasons that we have for trusting one another. So there are good reasons to trust science, and she articulates them in terms of its sustained engagement with the world, and also the sort of rigorous practice of achieving consensus. But then also there is this value-based ground for trust in science, that the practitioners of science very often share the same values that the people who are kind of science consumers or recipients of scientific communications have. So they share those values in common, in other words. Still, that doesn't seem to be quite enough. So if you hearken back to one of the first things that we read, this interesting paper by Neil Levy, where he says left and right don't occupy different realities, it's just that they put their trust in different sources. It doesn't quite seem like this sustained engagement with reality, this commitment to rigorous consensus production, and this focus on shared values can get us that additional trust that we need to kind of break through these sort of partisan commitments where people almost have a kind of tribal commitment to trusting people within their own tribe. And so it's hard to break through even with this educational arm where you show that, yeah, science is engaged in this sort of fundamental way with reality, and also scientists share your values and your commitments. That doesn't quite seem to be enough. There seems to be other dimensions to trust that get missed out in that picture. And we see that also in the discussion of echo chambers, when you have people who come up in an echo chamber and they have this kind of background belief that only a small number of individuals are trustworthy. It doesn't seem like we're going to be able to break through there either. What I'm saying, I guess, is that there are other hindrances to trust and other elements involved in trusting people that we haven't quite brought into view yet. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is what are some of the other obstacles to trust that we haven't talked about yet, and what ways can we find around them?